3 years ago, a man stood in the middle of a neighborhood meeting screaming that I was abusing my power as HOA president. His face was bright red, his wife was crying beside him, and half the room was staring at me like they were watching the final scene of a courtroom drama. The ironic part was that this same couple had spent years using the HOA to make everyone else's life miserable, and the only reason they were angry now was because, for the first time, the rules applied to them too. Looking back, none of this would have happened if I had simply ignored the first complaint letter that showed up in my mailbox. But sometimes a tiny annoyance grows into something much bigger, and before you know it, you're fighting a war you never planned to join. My name is Ethan Parker, and 6 years ago my wife Melissa and I bought a house in a subdivision called Willow Creek Meadows just outside Chattanooga. It wasn't a fancy neighborhood. Nobody drove Ferraris. Nobody lived in mansions. It was the kind of place where people waved when they drove by, and where neighbors actually knew each other's names. The HOA was mostly invisible. We paid our dues, cut our grass, and lived our lives. Honestly, I barely remembered the HOA existed most of the time. That changed when Leonard and Patricia Grayson moved into the blue house across the street. At first they seemed friendly enough. Leonard was retired from some government job he'd mention every chance he got. Patricia volunteered that information even when nobody asked. During their first neighborhood barbecue, Leonard spent more time asking questions than answering them. He wanted to know who parked where, who owned which vehicles, who rented their homes, who worked nights, who left for vacations. At the time, I thought he was just trying to get to know people. Now I realize he was building a database in his head. About 3 weeks after they moved in, I received a warning from the HOA. Apparently, my garbage bins had been visible from the street. I laughed when I opened the envelope because it had been trash collection day. The bins had literally been sitting outside waiting to be emptied. Melissa laughed too. We figured somebody had made a mistake. Then another notice arrived. This time my lawn was supposedly above the maximum allowed height. I walked outside with a tape measure because I couldn't believe it. The HOA limit was 3 inches. My grass measured around 2 3/4. I remember standing in my front yard staring at that tape measure thinking, somebody is actually out here measuring grass. A week later I got another complaint. A vehicle had supposedly been parked on the street overnight. Technically that was true, except it wasn't my vehicle. My brother had visited from Nashville and stayed one night before driving home. Somehow that became an official neighborhood issue. Then another complaint arrived. Then another. Then another. By the end of 3 months, I had accumulated 11 separate complaints. 11. Every single one involved something tiny. Every single one forced me to respond. Every single one created stress that didn't need to exist. What bothered me most wasn't the letters themselves. It was the feeling of constantly being watched. Every time I pulled into my driveway, I found myself wondering if somebody was documenting it. Every time I worked in my yard, I felt like someone was judging me from behind a curtain. Melissa noticed the change before I did. One evening she looked at me through the kitchen window while I was trimming bushes and said, "You know you're looking over your shoulder every 5 minutes, right?" I laughed it off, but she was right. The neighborhood that used to feel comfortable suddenly felt different. Then one morning I discovered why. It was just after 6. I was getting ready for work when I glanced through the front window. Across the street stood Leonard. He wasn't gardening. He wasn't walking his dog. He wasn't getting his newspaper. He was standing perfectly still on his porch holding a pair of binoculars. At first I thought I was imagining things. Then I noticed the notebook in his hand. He'd look through the binoculars, write something down, then look again. I actually laughed because the whole thing looked ridiculous. It would have been funny if it wasn't happening to me. That was the moment I knew exactly where the complaints were coming from. Unfortunately, knowing and proving are 2 different things. A week later, I attended my first HOA board meeting hoping someone would take the situation seriously. The HOA president, a man named Russell Brennan, had been running the association for nearly a decade. He sat at the front of the room like a small-town politician who'd forgotten he worked for the residents. I explained everything. I brought dates, photographs, copies of complaint letters, and examples showing several accusations were false. Russell listened with all the enthusiasm of a man waiting for a dentist appointment. When I finished, he simply shrugged. "Complaints are anonymous," he said. "The board has an obligation to investigate all reports, even when somebody is obviously abusing the system." I asked. Another shrug. "That's how the process works." I walked out of that meeting angry, But what happened over the next few weeks made me realize my problem wasn't just Leonard and Patricia. My problem was the entire system. As I started talking to other homeowners, a pattern emerged. Marcus down the street had received 6 complaints about his work truck. Linda had been reported because of holiday decorations. A young couple near the entrance had been cited over a basketball hoop. Different houses, different people, same ridiculous complaints, same timing, same suspects. And every conversation ended with the same defeated expression. Nobody believed anything could be done. One night, I sat alone at my kitchen table staring at another violation letter while Melissa loaded dishes into the dishwasher. After a few minutes, she looked over and quietly asked, "So how much longer are you going to let these people control your life?" I didn't answer right away because the truth was I didn't know. But that question stayed in my head all night long, and by the next morning I had made a decision that would eventually turn the entire neighborhood upside down. The next morning I woke up with something I hadn't felt in months: clarity. Up until then, I'd been reacting to everything Leonard and Patricia Grayson threw at me. Every complaint, every warning letter, every ridiculous accusation had forced me onto defense. I spent my time proving I wasn't guilty instead of asking why the system allowed obvious abuse in the first place. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, staring at my bedroom ceiling while Melissa slept beside me, I realized something simple. If I couldn't beat the HOA from the outside, maybe I needed to understand it from the inside. So I started showing up. Every meeting, every committee gathering, every budget review, every boring discussion about landscaping contracts and mailbox standards. At first, nobody paid attention to me. I was just another homeowner sitting quietly in the back of the room taking notes. But I was paying attention, and what I discovered surprised me. The more I listened, the more I realized the HOA wasn't being run the way residents thought it was. Russell Brennan liked presenting himself as a hard-working volunteer, sacrificing his free time for the neighborhood, but the reality was very different. Most homeowners never attended meetings, which meant nobody questioned anything. Decisions were approved in minutes. Financial reports were skimmed over. Rules were selectively enforced. The same handful of people controlled everything because nobody else cared enough to look. Meanwhile, Leonard and Patricia continued their campaign. Another complaint claimed my garage door had remained open too long. Another claimed weeds were growing near my fence. One notice accused me of storing construction materials in my backyard. The construction materials turned out to be 3 bags of mulch. At one point I received a complaint because a package had sat on my porch for 2 days while I was away on business. A package. I remember sitting at my kitchen table holding that letter and laughing so hard Melissa thought I'd finally lost my mind. "What's funny?" she asked. I handed her the notice. She read it, stared at me, and shook her head. These people need hobbies. The thing was, Leonard already had a hobby. The neighborhood was his hobby. Controlling people was his hobby. And once I started seeing things through that lens, everything made sense. The complaints weren't really about rules. They were about power. He enjoyed knowing he could make people nervous. He enjoyed forcing others to justify themselves. He enjoyed creating consequences without ever facing any himself. That's when my anger changed into something more useful: determination. I spent the next several months reading every HOA document I could find. Bylaws, financial statements, meeting minutes, election procedures. If it existed, I read it. Some nights I'd sit at the dining room table until midnight highlighting sections while Melissa watched television in the living room. More than once she walked past and asked, "Are you seriously reading HOA bylaws for fun?" "No," I'd say. "I'm reading them for revenge." She'd laugh, but I wasn't entirely joking. Then one evening I found something interesting. Russell Brennan wasn't supposed to still be president. According to the governing documents, board members were subject to term limitations. Russell had exceeded them by nearly 2 years. I checked again because I thought I must have misunderstood. Then I checked a third time. Same answer. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. There were expenditures approved without formal votes. Maintenance contracts lacking proper documentation. Decisions recorded incorrectly in meeting minutes. Nothing criminal, but enough procedural violations to make people uncomfortable. For the first time, I realized Russell's authority wasn't nearly as solid as he wanted everyone to believe. Around the same time, more residents began talking to me. Word spread that I was researching HOA procedures. People started stopping me during evening walks. Some shared stories. Others shared documents. One neighbor produced old meeting records. Another showed emails. A retired accountant named Jerry helped me review financial statements. What started as frustration slowly turned into a coalition. One afternoon, Jerry leaned back in his chair and said something I'll never forget. The problem isn't that Russell is corrupt. The problem is nobody has ever challenged him. That sentence hit me harder than I expected because he was right. The entire system survived on apathy. Everyone complained privately. Nobody acted publicly. Once I understood that, the path forward became obvious. We needed a vote. According to HOA bylaws, residents could call for a vote of no confidence if enough homeowners signed a petition. Most people didn't even know the rule existed. Russell probably assumed nobody would ever use it. Over the next several weeks, I knocked on doors throughout Willow Creek Meadows. Not campaigning, not arguing, just talking. I listened more than I spoke. I heard stories about selective enforcement, stories about ignored concerns, stories about residents feeling powerless. And almost every conversation eventually circled back to Leonard and Patricia. They had become symbols of something larger. Not because they were the most powerful people in the neighborhood, but because they represented everything homeowners were tired of. By the time we finished collecting signatures, I had far more support than I expected. 28 homeowners signed, then 32, then 37. On the night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. People who hadn't attended a meeting in years suddenly showed up. Russell looked nervous before the meeting even started. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know what. When public comments began, I stood up. My hands were shaking slightly, but my voice stayed steady. I cited the bylaw section, presented the petition, requested a vote of no confidence. The room became silent. Russell's face changed immediately. "This is inappropriate," he snapped. "No, it's allowed under Article 7, I replied. He tried interrupting. I kept talking. He tried changing the subject. Residents pushed back. For the first time in years, he couldn't control the room. The vote happened 30 minutes later. And it wasn't close. Russell lost. The room erupted into conversation as people processed what had just happened. Some looked shocked. Others looked relieved. I mostly felt exhausted. But things were only beginning. HOA elections were scheduled for the following month, and several residents encouraged me to run. At first I resisted. Honestly, becoming HOA president sounded like volunteering for a headache. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized walking away would accomplish nothing. We had removed the old leadership. Somebody had to replace it. So I entered the race. What followed felt strangely similar to a small-town political campaign. I spent evenings knocking on doors. I answered questions. I listened to concerns. I promised transparency and consistency. Most importantly, I promised that rules would apply equally to everyone. Friends, critics, longtime residents, new arrivals, everyone. Meanwhile, Leonard and Patricia became increasingly hostile. They stopped waving. They glared whenever I walked by. Once I caught Leonard photographing my house while I was standing in the driveway. When he noticed me watching, he simply lifted his camera a little higher as if daring me to react. I smiled and waved. That seemed to annoy him more than any argument ever could. Election night arrived 6 weeks later. The clubhouse was crowded again. Ballots were counted. Results announced. And when everything was finished, I had won by a landslide. 41 votes out of 49. I still remember the mixture of emotions washing over me as residents congratulated me. Pride, relief, anxiety. Because despite everything we'd accomplished, I knew the hardest part hadn't happened yet. Winning the election wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The following Monday, I sat alone in the HOA office reviewing records and learning the systems I'd inherited. Most of it was routine paperwork. Then I opened the complaint database. At first, I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was simply familiarizing myself with how reports were submitted. That's when I noticed a pattern. One address appeared repeatedly, again and again. Different complaints, different targets, same source. I kept scrolling. The number grew larger. 20 reports, 30, 40, 50. By the time I finished reviewing the records, I was staring at evidence that confirmed what half the neighborhood had suspected for years. 52 complaints had originated from the same household, Leonard and Patricia's household. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the screen. Not because I was surprised, because I finally had proof. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I realized the game was about to change completely. The very next board meeting, I introduced a policy requiring all complaints to include the homeowner's name and address. No more anonymous reports. No more hiding. The motion passed easily. Most residents applauded. Leonard looked like someone had unplugged his favorite toy. But that wasn't the part that truly changed everything. Because after the policy update came something every new HOA president was authorized to conduct. A full neighborhood compliance inspection, and when I started reviewing properties one by one, I eventually arrived at a familiar house across the street, where years of judgment, accusations, and hypocrisy were waiting behind a freshly painted white fence. When I pulled up in front of Leonard and Patricia Grayson's house with my inspection clipboard, I wasn't smiling, I wasn't celebrating, and despite what some people later claimed, I wasn't looking for revenge. The truth is actually more complicated than that. For months, I had promised residents that the rules would finally apply equally to everyone. And the moment I skipped a house because of personal history, everything I had fought for would become meaningless. So I walked the property the same way I had walked every other property in Willow Creek Meadows. The difference was that unlike most homeowners, the Graysons had spent years focusing on everyone else's violations instead of their own. It didn't take long. The mailbox was rusted. Weeds had spread through several landscaping beds. Trash containers were visible from the street. Paint along one side of the house was badly faded. Part of the gutter system had separated from the roofline. Several cracks ran across the driveway. And sitting near the front walkway was a decorative concrete statue that technically required architectural approval paperwork, which had never been submitted. 7 violations. 7 completely legitimate violations. I took photographs, documented everything, and submitted the report exactly the same way I had for every other homeowner. 30 days later, correction notices were mailed. 3 days after that, Leonard came pounding on my front door. I opened it before he could knock again. His face was already red. "This is retaliation," he barked. "You waited all this time just to come after us." I remember leaning against the doorframe and looking at him calmly. "Leonard, I inspected every property in the neighborhood. Don't play games with me." "I'm not playing games. You targeted us." "No," I said. "The rules targeted you. I just enforced them." For a second I thought he might actually explode. Patricia stood near the sidewalk watching the conversation with her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Neither of them seemed prepared for the possibility that the standards they demanded for years might someday apply to their own home. They left angry, but they still had 30 days to make corrections. Most homeowners would have handled everything immediately. The Graysons fixed 3 items and ignored the rest. The deadline expired. Fines began. The first notice wasn't enormous, but it got their attention. The second notice got even more attention. By the 3rd week, they were calling emergency meetings and demanding hearings. During one particularly memorable board session, Leonard stood in front of a packed room and accused me of conducting a personal vendetta. When he finally stopped talking, one elderly resident in the back quietly raised her hand. It was Sandra, a widow who had once been reported over harmless holiday decorations. "Leonard," she said softly, "do you remember telling me rules are rules?" The room became silent. Leonard didn't answer. A few people smiled. Others looked down, trying not to laugh. Because everyone remembered. For years that had been his favorite phrase. Rules are rules. Suddenly he didn't seem to like it quite as much. 6 weeks later, after more than $2,000 in accumulated fines, contractors began showing up at the Grayson property. The driveway was repaired. The paint was redone. The weeds disappeared. The gutter was replaced. The decorative statue vanished. One by one, every violation was corrected. Just like that, the people who had spent years monitoring everyone else finally complied with the standards they claimed to value so much. And then something unexpected happened. The neighborhood got quieter, not because people were afraid. Quite the opposite. Residents stopped worrying about anonymous complaints. Meetings became less hostile. Conversations became easier. Families started participating again. For the first time in years, it felt like people were actually neighbors instead of suspects. Even Leonard changed, at least a little. He stopped standing on the porch with binoculars. He stopped documenting everyone's activities. He stopped treating the neighborhood like a personal surveillance project. We never became friends, but eventually we reached an unspoken truce. We'd nod when passing each other. Nothing more, nothing less. Looking back now, I don't think the real victory was winning the election or issuing fines. The real victory was proving that fairness matters more than authority. Power without accountability eventually becomes abuse, whether it belongs to an HOA president, a board member, or a retiree with too much free time and a pair of binoculars. Sometimes people ask if I regret becoming HOA president. Honestly, there were days when I absolutely did. The meetings were exhausting. The complaints never completely disappeared. Somebody always found a reason to be unhappy. But if I hadn't stepped forward, nothing would have changed. The Graysons would have kept filing complaints. Russell would have kept running the HOA unchecked. Everyone would have kept complaining privately while accepting things publicly. Instead, people finally pushed back. The funny thing is, I never created new rules. I never invented penalties. I never changed the standards. I simply made sure the same standards applied to everybody. And maybe that's why this story still starts arguments whenever I tell it. Some people think I gave the Graysons exactly what they deserved. Others think I went too far and should have shown more mercy. Personally, I think the answer lives somewhere in the middle. Justice feels a lot different when you're the one receiving it. So here's my question for you. If you spent years being targeted by neighbors who constantly reported you, then suddenly found yourself in charge of enforcing the rules, what would you have done? Would you have handled it exactly the same way? Or would you have taken a different path? Let me know down in the comments, because I have a feeling this one is going to divide people right down the middle. And if you've ever dealt with a nightmare HOA, a power-hungry neighbor, or a community dispute that got completely out of control, share your story too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around for more unbelievable neighborhood drama that proves sometimes the biggest battles happen right outside your front door.